In November 1885, we find Vincent van Gogh at the Antwerp Academy, where he does not stay for very long, but it's during his time in Antwerp that he looks at the work by Rubens and Delacroix and becomes exposed to this type of art. One of the things we see repeated in Van Gogh's paintings are the boots or the shoes, and at each phase we can kind of see where he is at artistically. From Antwerp, he decides to move to Paris, and what happens actually is Theo essentially comes back to work and finds a message that his brother is waiting for him at the Louvre, and there you have it. So, an unexpected visit by Vincent van Gogh. And he moves in with Theo, even though Theo has a very, very small apartment. But this is the interesting thing about Vincent van Gogh. Once he gets to Paris, we see a very radical shift in his compositions, especially in just playing out the color that he's using. I think that once he arrived in Paris, he saw the paintings of the time, in particular the 8th Impressionist exhibition, he saw that his work was very dark and almost dreary. And it's from this point in Paris that we have this radical change, and we see Vincent van Gogh embracing a huge amount of color in his palette in a way where it almost seems like we're looking at a completely different artist than we did in the first two parts of this lecture. Again, when we think about the influences that Theo would have, showing him these different artists. Some of these artists we find in the 8th Impressionist exhibition. This was the final Impressionist exhibition, but as we look through the names here, we can see many of the names that have a profound influence on Vincent van Gogh. Camille Pissarro, of course, has a profound influence on everyone from this period, but we have George Seurat, the very famous pointillist artist, and also Paul Signac, another artist who works in the pointillist style. These are both what we refer to as neo-impressionist, coming at the end of the group, if you will, more friends with Seurat, and that's why they're in with this exhibition. But their extraordinarily vibrant color usage and how they're actually applying the paint, this is where we really see Van Gogh working from. Another thing we see him doing in his time in Paris is actually engaging in what I think of as a formal anatomy study, a formal study of human anatomy, an effort to draw in a realistic sense. When we look at most of these studies, from my understanding, the majority of these actually come from small models or books on drawing or even magazines, rather than exclusively from life models. But again, this is something that we kind of have occurring at the same time as his exploration in terms of paint, as we see this effort to draw in this classical sense almost. It's as if he realizes he didn't have a formal art education, and it was he was going to take it upon himself to do this. Here we have the Discobolus by Myron in drawing form, and I've included a version of the statue that you would have seen in England. Again, it is my belief that Vincent never saw this statue when he was drawing this, that this is a drawing that he did from a magazine or a figure studying type of instrument. But again, when we look at this, when we look at how he's defining the tones in the back, the separation of the muscles, and how we have all these open planes, especially with the discus itself moving forward, his use of hatching lines, everything that you might expect from an academically skilled artist, we find from Vincent van Gogh with almost just a very small amount of formal academic training. Some of the subject matter we see from him is La Moulin de la Galette. The galette is a small loaf of bread, and this is a mill that was very famous for making that small loaf of bread. This was located more on the outskirts of Paris. It was a very, very famous spot for the locals to kind of go. They would have balls and dances there. But this was a spot that Vincent painted quite a few times in this period of his life. Again, if you're familiar with your art history, we've actually seen this site before. We'll see it again in a second, but we do have several different vantage points of this famous windmill that you can actually go see that windmill today if you are visiting Paris. And of course, the Moulin de la Galette we saw before in the very famous Renoir painting depicting a ball being held there. Just by way of comparison, you can see we have a very stark and different event by way of Van Gogh, the sense of loneliness. And when we look at the painting from 1886 by Vincent Van Gogh, this is a very Vincent Van Gogh painting. Of remark are the birds up in the sky, how he's reduced them to almost just simple black brush strokes. And as we look at the panels of bricks, we see those broad brush strokes that we associate so much with Vincent Van Gogh's later work, here hidden in the refinement of this brick wall, if you will, almost as an excuse to show this display of color. It's also right around this time that we see the first self-portraits done by Vincent Van Gogh, something that he will, of course, be very famous for in his artistic career. But this is also some of the first instances we have where he's directly portraying people from a frontal vantage point. Again, this portrait style, if we think back to his earlier work, we really don't see anything of this nature. Most of the people he presents are isolated people, and even in the instance of the potato eaters, they're set at a distance from us, and it's a grouping of people rather than a single portrait. Again, with these early paintings, you can see he's almost experimenting with how does one make a portrait, either self or otherwise. Terrace of a cafe at Montmartre. The Montmartre is the kind of the art district in town, if you will. But when we look at this, we were reminded of the impasto effect, and we start to see what Van Gogh is doing that is so very interesting, and that is building up the layers in an appropriate, almost three-dimensional fashion, where you really do get the feeling that railing and the benches are set forward in comparison to that of the background, with that thick, heavy use of paint pushed onto the canvas surface, really creating a three-dimensional model almost of what you would have actually seen. Again, we very much think of paintings as being this flat, two-dimensional surface, but when we approach art like Van Gogh, we see this thick buildup. Just as a reminder, I always think of this as a remarkable thing when we look at the 14th of July celebration on the left, that this has only really been a year since the potato eaters. And when we look at the transformation that's occurred within Vincent Van Gogh, within this time frame, how he's gone from this incredibly dark, almost depressing style of art, somewhat realistic, and then we look on the left and we see this in vibrant tones of him applying this paint in very thick clumps. We have these beautiful use of the primaries with the red and the blue and the yellow really just penetrating off of the canvas surface, exploding in our eyes, if you will. It's also during this time that we see Vincent engaging in this entire selection of still lifes, all based around different types of flowers. This is a small selection that we'll be looking at. But again, what I really find interesting from these paintings is the variety by which he paints them. If you look at the different paintings as individuals, we have some aspects of realism, but we also have some aspects of impressionism leading into post-impressionism, if you will, that we know from Vincent Van Gogh. Again, this very thick buildup of paint on the surface, with each of the petals really resonating as an individual form. But in other areas of the painting, we see an effort at just creating a nice simple painting. Here's a wonderful comparison of what I'm speaking of. Again, on the left, a very crowded composition. Again, very much realistic depiction of how these flowers would be seen if we were to see this type of display in real life. But then we move over to the right and we have something that looks much more like a Vincent Van Gogh painting with these thicker marks and not the delicacy of form that we see on the left, more of these larger forms that he's creating, letting the paint really create a surface, if you will, by which it pushes off of the canvas surface. Again, in my mind, he's exploring, he's seeing what paint can do. Here we have a view of Paris from Montmartre from 1886. In 1887, Theo had enough of him, as the story goes, and he moves him out to an apartment in the suburbs, an area called Agnières. It's also in November of 1887 that he meets Paul Gauguin. He meets Paul Gauguin through Theo. Paul Gauguin was looking for a new gallery, if you will, and brought in some of his work, and both Theo and Vincent were very impressed with what they saw. This relationship will, of course, continue much later on in Vincent's life. This will be the beginning of part 2, if you will. But again, what we really see here is just a continuation of his work in Paris. A lot of this deciding or figuring out, if you will, exactly how to paint and how he in particular wants to paint. We return to the motive of a pair of shoes again, this time not as realistic, much more of an abstraction. You can see those points that look like the nails on the bottom of the shoe. On the right, we have a depiction of absinthe, and as it is known, Vincent Van Gogh very much loved absinthe. He had a very rough lifestyle, drank a lot of absinthe, smoked a lot of cigarettes, did not eat a lot of food, and as we know, in addition, was very, very much a frequenter of the brothels at the time. We know that he most likely had social disease at 1 or 2 times in his life. As we look at the work he's doing in Agnières, this really seems very much influenced by the pointillist style of Signac. He's kind of calmed down the colors of what we think of as Paul Signac's work, but again, we can physically see the brushstrokes in front of us. We can almost imagine the artist with the brush in their hand putting the pieces down. Again, this is neo-impressionism. This is really a separation of what you see down to very, very fine points. A lot of this relies on color theory, the use of colors either in a warm or cool fashion, and also using complementary colors directly in connection with each other. We continue here with 2 more works, and again, when we look at the bridge over the River Seine at Agnières from 1887, we're developing more of what we associate as the Vincent Van Gogh style. We see these larger brush strokes forming what we think of as larger areas or planes, but fusing together as well. We see his experimentation with using different color tones in close proximity with each other as well. Again, we still have this very modern scene, though, with a train crossing over the river, showing maybe a wonderful piece to almost show the difference between where he was before and where he is now in terms of his mentality.